Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are out there. My name is Julie Kientz. I'm a professor and department chair of Human-Centered Design and Engineering at the University of Washington. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Gregory Abowd, today's speaker and recipient of the 2023 Association for Computing Machinery's Sig Chi Lifetime Research Award. And I'm here as a representative of Gregory's extensive academic family. Much of my introduction of Gregory is going to focus on family and the importance of it in Gregory's career. Most of you know Gregory, or at least know of him, as he has accomplished so much and contributed so much to the fields of human-computer interaction and ubiquitous computing. Gregory received his bachelor's degree in math from the University of Notre Dame, his master's and doctor of philosophy from Oxford University in computation, where he was a Rhodes Scholar and specialized in software engineering. After postdocs at the University of York and at Carnegie Mellon University, he joined the faculty at Georgia Tech, where he stayed for 27 years, being named a Regents Professor, holding an endowed chair position, and serving as an associate dean in the College of Computing. 3 years ago, he left Georgia Tech and became a professor and dean of the College of Engineering at Northeastern University. Gregory has received numerous awards for his impactful work, including the Sig Chi Social Impact Award and the ACM Eugene Lawler Humanitarian Award for his work on applying computing to people with autism. He is a member of the Chi Academy and an ACM Fellow. He's received a number of Best Paper Awards and multiple Test of Time Awards. He is the world's leading scholar in the invention and application of ubiquitous computing technologies. His research has defined the field of ubiquitous computing for the last 30 years, starting with context-aware computing and the automated capture and access of live experiences, to instrumented smart homes, using built-in infrastructure to sense activities in a space, to the creation of novel materials that are both self-sustaining and computational. He has applied his unique and novel inventions to education, issues impacting people who care for and live with autism, to health more broadly, and most recently, sustainability at scale. Gregory has also been an incredible community builder, both in the large and in the small. Outside of his research group, he has created multiple communities. He co-authored the first textbook on human-computer interaction, and he was the general chair of the first conference on ubiquitous computing, or UbiComp. He was on the founding editorial board for IEEE Pervasive Computing magazine. He was the founding editor-in-chief for the Foundations and Trends in HCI Journal, and for the Proceedings of the ACM in Interactive, Mobile, Wearable, and Ubiquitous Technologies. He served as the founding president and board chair for the Atlanta Autism Consortium for almost 15 years. Now, these are all things you can find out yourself if you Googled for him or asked ChatGPT. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Gregory, the individual behind this amazing research career. Gregory is all about family. He has an incredibly supportive family, his wife, Megan, sons, Aiden and Blaze, and daughter, Mary Catherine. Gregory would be the first to say he wouldn't be so accomplished without his family, who not only support him, but also help to focus and inspire his impactful research. Gregory also himself comes from a big family, being one of 12 brothers and sisters. They pushed and supported him as well, and also serve as a source of inspiration and collaboration, and he spends a lot of time with them and their families. And then there's Gregory's academic family, which is much bigger. He has graduated 39 PhD students from Georgia Tech and currently informally advises multiple PhD students at Northeastern. If you consider his PhD graduates as his academic children, he has children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren. I'm sure it's only a matter of time before he has great-great-great-grandchildren. In his academic family, he has 197 PhDs and postdocs that descend from him, including current PhD students. Including current PhD students, the academic family totals 366. Among Gregory's first-generation PhD students include 19 faculty members in 6 countries, 5 Chi Academy members, 2 ACM fellows, 2 deans, 1 department chair, 1 vice provost, an ACM prize and computing winner, and a MacArthur winner. Many of his students have gone on to exciting careers in industry and startups as well. I have the pleasure of having been Gregory's 13th graduated PhD student. I had the great fortune of being advised as an REU student by Anin Day, who originally introduced this talk for him, who was advised by Gregory, and who was his second graduate PhD student, and he was at UC Berkeley at the time. As someone who had no prior experience with research or graduate school, I was completely clueless on where to apply or even how. And Nin told me that I had to apply to Georgia Tech and I had to work with Gregory. I had no idea how lucky I was to have stumbled into the Abowd academic family at the time. When I joined Gregory's lab in 2003, I became his 12th PhD student at the time. I couldn't believe how warmly welcomed I was by members of the lab and how quickly they became some of my closest friends. Gregory's lab embodied a spirit of collaboration with a bit of friendly competition that made things fun and motivating. The best way for him to motivate us was to say, "I don't think it can be done," and proving him wrong. Many of us also fondly remember decorating his office with toilet-themed decor, covering every square inch with balloons or aluminum foil, which he was always such a good sport about. I've known him for almost 20 years now at this point, and every day I still feel his influence. He taught us all that it's so important to be a mentor and to pull people up the ladder behind you as you climb towards success. He has always been so generous by putting those with less power into the spotlight. He made sure we had access to opportunities, got credit and recognition for our work, and gave us a shout out in every instance he could. Grad school is known to have been a hard road for many, but for me, it was an absolute blast due to the culture of collaboration and spirit of inquisitiveness and excitement that Gregory helped instill in all of us. We had high autonomy in what we did, but also high levels of support, both from him and from the senior PhD students in the lab. He taught us to, quote, scratch our own itch and find research projects that were personally meaningful to us, which helped us find much meaning and satisfaction on the things that we worked on. He taught us that you can have an amazing career by always putting your students first, which I can say has always carried me forward as I just graduated my own 15th PhD student this year. If you look across his PhD students, all of them can point to similar experiences with Gregory. He has and continues to be an amazing mentor. He is still the first person many of us call when we need advice. It's through Gregory that I met my husband, who was his 14th PhD student. He and his wife welcomed me and to his family at every opportunity, and I loved getting to see his kids grow up and get to know each of their amazing personalities. Gregory spoke at our wedding. As officiator, spoke at the weddings of many of his PhD students. Gregory wasn't just our PhD advisor, he was our friend, our confidant, our role model, and our family. 20 years later, and I still reach out to him for advice on major decisions. I know many others in the academic family reach out as well. Being part of the ABOT academic family, you gain a whole lot of people that you share a common bond with and you can turn to for advice. We share students, we compete for students, we write grants together, we publish together, we rely on each other. Gregory, you've given us so much as individuals, but it's probably the greatest gift as a whole as the academic family, many of whom I consider to be my actual family. Another wonderful example of this, 3 of us former PhD students were inducted to the Chi Academy this year. Gregory called into the awards ceremony to cheer us on at 3:30 a.m. when he had to catch a flight just a few hours later. It was so important for him to always be there for us and at every PhD hooding. And each of us had given him a heartfelt thank you from the influence he has had from our lives. Gregory has a way of bringing out the best of the people he works in, faculty and students alike. He has served as a role model about how to integrate work and life, how to follow your passions. He has demonstrated a path for working on impactful problems that improve the lives of others long before this became the norm in the HCI community. He has made it clear to his academic family that you can have both academic success and real-world impact, and that the two don't have to be mutually exclusive. And he has served as a role model on how to be good advisors to our own students and how to fight for what you believe in. Gregory, as one of the members of the first generation of your academic family, I want you to know how proud we are of you in this award. Not just for your research contributions and contributions to the Sig Chi community, but for everything you've done for us as individuals and a large family. You continue to show up for us, and I'm glad we can show up for you today. Many of us here in the audience wouldn't be who you are without your unconditional support. I know I wouldn't. We love you. I love you. Please join me in congratulating Gregory on being the recipient of the 2023 Sig Chi Lifetime Achievement Research Award. Gregory, we look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Julie. I told you it was going to bring tears to my eyes. The ironic thing is the only people who couldn't hear that are the people in the room here, because in my haste to set up the room, I didn't set up the speaker in the room. So, and a number of them were sitting outside the room, didn't even know it even started. So if you get a chance, you should listen to the recording. Julie did a beautiful introduction. And it's probably going to far exceed the quality of this presentation. So I apologize in advance to the people online, the people here in the room. They didn't have that problem. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a career retrospective. I really, what I most valued about getting this award was the opportunity to take the time to reflect and to share some of the accomplishments of my career, but much more than that, lessons I've learned about how to be the kind of researcher that I've become, and working with the amazing people that I've had the opportunity to work with over 30 some years. So here's what I'm going to talk about, and the main message here is that people in your lives matter. So I'm going to take a little course through my career starting in 1985. It'll go back to. And the reason I gave the title Ignorance is Bliss is that you'll see in my career changes, path changes I've made, both in terms of what I decided to study in grad school, what I worked on as a postdoc, what I did when I joined the faculty at Georgia Tech, and during my 27 years at Georgia Tech. And often, if I had thought in advance what little knowledge I had of the new area I was moving into and how hard the problem was going to be, I may have hesitated to have made the career changes that I did. But I no longer worry about that because I've realized that when you're with the right people alongside you, you can figure out just about any kind of problem, and the journey is well worth it. The corollary to this, and there'll be some examples in my talk, is that we all have people that we interact with that are serve as mentors to us or models or examples. And there are two kinds of people in this world: those whose behaviors you want to imitate, and those whose behaviors you do not want to imitate. And sometimes the same person can represent both of those examples. So you can learn from both positive and negative examples in your life. And this talk is mainly a big thank you to the large number of collaborators that I've had, students and faculty and friends and family. So try to sum up some lessons learned I'm going to come back to at the end, and will be sprinkled throughout. First, find those who believe in you and don't worry about the people who do not believe in you. It sometimes matters much more who you are working with than what you are working on. In your life, you are always making an impression on people, positive or negative. Leadership and leaders matter. I didn't used to think this was true, but I think it's true in retrospect. If you focus your efforts on the needs and goals of others, your needs will be addressed. Another way to think about this is it's amazing how much can be accomplished if you don't worry about who gets credit. The last piece is something that I think is very important for people beginning a career, changing paths in a career. Early success breeds confidence. So I'm going to try to give some examples of these throughout, and then we'll come back to the end. So I'm going to start back my undergraduate years. I was at the University of Notre Dame, and if people wonder why I have so much swag in my life, I wear Northeastern things. I've brought some gifts for the people that are in attendance here. It's because there are two places in this world, two organizations that thrive on swag. One is the University of Notre Dame, and I'm one of 12 children. 10 of us graduated or attended Notre Dame. 9 graduated from Notre Dame. My father graduated from Notre Dame. We have Notre Dame t-shirts out the wazoo. The other is Disney, right? And I spend a lot of time at Disney properties, as those who know me. So those two plays, that's the reason why swag to me matters. But a very quick story here. When I was at Notre Dame, I played the bass drum in the marching band. And my junior year, we were very jealous of the drum corps for the Air Force Academy, because they were not only tight, which is a drummer, they were just all together. They did interesting stunts while they were performing on our field. One of the stunts they did was the bass drums flipped over on their head and played their bass drum solo. And so we decided the last home game of the year, we were going to do the same thing. The only problem was the band director told us not to do it. And so they left it up to me. They said, Gregory, if the time comes for the drum solo and you think we're going to do it, throw your hat down, we'll follow you, and we will back you up afterwards. So time came, threw my hat down, we did it. There's the picture. They did not back me up. I was kicked out of the band right after the game. Now, the good part about this is this individual, John Kozak, was associate dean for the College of Science, and I was a College of Science student studying mathematics and physics. He wrote a letter of recommendation for me for all the colleges I was applying for grad school, but also for some prestigious scholarships that I was applying to, one of which was the Rhodes Scholarship. And it became a tremendous icebreaker that was unaware of. When I was interviewing at the state level and the regional level, the interview panel would come up to me and talk about this incident. And I said, how do you know about that? Because I certainly didn't write about this. This is not something I'm particularly proud of. Well, in the letter, Dr. Kozak wrote that you may notice there is one blemish on Gregory's academic record, and it's a withdrawal from marching band his junior year, and he told the story of what had happened. And that became a very nice icebreaker that had people seeing, more the human side, the kind of rebellious leader side, which ended up working. I was fortunate to be awarded a Rhodes Scholarship. So sometimes these crazy things you do, even if it right after the fact you regret it, they come back to help you. So as a result, after I graduated from Notre Dame, I went across the puddle to Oxford, England, and pursued 2 degrees in computer science. It was called computation at Oxford. This picture here of the White Horse Pub on Broad Street, my room, my first year, is literally that white window right above the sign for the White Horse Pub. And at that time, pubs closed at 11 o'clock in the evening, and I would sit on the windowsill of my of my room. I would get up from a full evening's worth of studying, obviously, and I would see the people coming out of the pub and would have a wonderful time with them. But I want to tell you intellectually how I was unintentionally rescued as a PhD student. Now, there are probably a lot of people here or in their PhD or had their PhD and understand that a lot of a PhD journey are ups and downs. I spent the first year and a half of a 3-year PhD program at Oxford doing not much at all and not knowing what I was going to do. And one day, this gentleman, my advisor, Mr. Bernard Suffren, interesting story about why he's a Mr. If you want to know, I can tell you later. He gave me a chapter of a book that he was writing, trying to give me some busy work because he saw that I wasn't doing much of anything. And I read this book, and for the first time, I was being trained as a mathematician, a formal methods person in software engineering. And for the first time, I saw that you could apply those representations and techniques of discrete mathematics to problems of humans interacting with computers. And I said, that's crazy. And I read this article, and it very much inspired me. I said, this is what I'm going to do my thesis on. That's one of the moments in a PhD career that you often remember quite fondly, the time in which you said, I know what I'm gonna do. I went into my advisor's office, showed him all the corrections I had for his chapter, and said, I'm going to do this for my thesis. He said, well, Gregory, I just wrote that chapter, and I'm not going to pay attention to that stuff anymore at all, so you're on your own. I said, okay. So that was the one. I got the spark of inspiration, kind of not in the way I would have wanted. But the other thing that I discovered while I was in England was my future wife, Megan Burke, who joined Oxford as a mathematical biologist my 2nd year at Oxford. She was from Chicago. I was from Detroit. The joke was we were the only 2 people that could understand each other. So, and she has been my partner for 33 years now in marriage, and I've known her since 1988. So I had a topic for a PhD, but I had no support at Oxford whatsoever. The Rhodes Scholarship provides you 3 years of funding. The first year was a master's I had to take to convert from non-computer science into computer science, and then 3 years to complete the PhD, 2 years of which were funded. So I was faced with a 4th year without any funding, and what fell in my lap, kind of, was an opportunity at the University of York with this professor, Michael Harrison, who was the editor of the book that chapter was being written for. So I got to meet him, and he saw my passion for this particular problem. He also understood the challenge I was having at being on an island. at Oxford, trying to complete this work. And he offered me what was effectively a postdoc position before I was had completed my PhD. So I went up to York, and I worked on a European project with him that was related to this. And in the evenings and in the mornings, I would work on my thesis and was able to successfully defend that work. But I owe this man, Michael Harrison, a lot for essentially rescuing me and putting me in an environment with people who not only intellectually aligned with what I was working on, but also were like a family to me. And three of those individuals, Alan Dix, Janet Finley, and Russell Beal, convinced me that I should help them write what was effectively the first official textbook in the area of human-computer interaction. So interesting fact about these three individuals and myself. None of us had ever taught a course in human-computer interaction. So, of course, we were the obvious, fresh minds to try to address this particular topic. But it is a wonderful adventure. And this was a clear example of, if I had known how much work there was, at least this was in 1990, 91. We were putting the book together, how much work it was to write a book compared to writing a thesis. I would never have agreed to do this. And if I knew how much work there was in doing a second edition, and in doing a hugely revised third edition, and then refusing to do any further editions. I bow to people like Ben Schneiderman, who can come up with new editions, and Jenny Priest and Yvonne Rogers, who have endless editions of their book, but I couldn't stomach it. But it was a wonderful experience, and this actually helped build my reputation as I was a nobody in the UK, moving back to the US into academia. I had a book. Although many of your advisors for the PhD students out in the virtual world and here, the last thing they would tell you in computer science is to do a book, because anyone can publish a book. There's literally or virtually no peer review for a book. A book becomes valuable years later if it sticks around. So this was a gamble, and it turned out for the best for me. So now my wife and I moved back from England to the US, because my intention was always to come back to the US. I could only take so many days in my life with someone making fun of my accent and calling me Jeffrey. And so I decided I would come back to the US, where they call me George more than they call me Gregory. So we were in Pittsburgh for 2 years. And this was a beautiful image you have of the city of Pittsburgh when you go through the tunnels and see the merging of the three rivers. And there I continued initially my work in a formal method as a mathematician, applying work to software engineering, the design and analysis of large software systems at Carnegie Mellon, in their School of Computer Science and their Software Engineering Institute. A fantastic environment and a great opportunity that I saw for doing this kind of postdoc work. And you see on the left, I put this up there usually for my own students to look at that and say, what the hell was Gregory doing before he came to Georgia Tech? Because I completely understand this, but I'm sure that most people look at that and it looks like gobbledygook, because it's not pseudocode. This does not run anything. This is just mathematical formalisms. David Garland was my postdoc supervisor, as well as this man, Len Bass. Mary Shaw was a senior faculty member there, and she gave me one of the best pieces of advice. Is that, Gregory, when you're giving a paper presentation at a conference, your goal is not to regurgitate the contents of your paper. The goal is to get people to want to read your paper afterwards. Okay, very good piece of advice. And Mary had lots of those other kinds of pieces of advice. I also worked with this individual, Bonnie John, who is a well-known individual in the HCI field, who was one of the founding individuals of the HCI Institute at Carnegie Mellon. Because this is being recorded, I will not say the bad advice that I got from one of the four people on this list, but I will share that later. It's basically about how you should spend your time. And there are people who manage based on the amount of time you spend, and there are people who manage based on the results. I'm very much a results-oriented person, and anyone that would tell me you must work 100 hours a week in order to be a good postdoc, I just say, what's the reason for that? Okay, that's in 1994. I got a position at Georgia Tech in the College of Computing. Wonderful story I can tell people about the months leading up to that position and why I chose Georgia Tech. But I'll give you a couple of these reasons, and it's the people. So Peter Freeman was the founding dean of the College of Computing. The first thing he did as the dean is he hired Jim Foley, who came in number 2 for the computing position. And Jim Foley came and established the GVU Center, which was the epicenter for HCI research and other research, graphics research and scientific visualization research at Georgia Tech, and put Georgia Tech on the map. These 2 individuals were the reason I went to Georgia Tech. Right? Not only because they were very welcoming, they were very supportive, they were very friendly and warm individuals. And I saw them throughout the career, what they did to build the College of Computing at Georgia Tech and build the GVU Center. Now, on this notion of first impressions, Colin Potts, who's now the provost at Missouri Institute of Science and Technology, and Kishore Ramachandran, those are the first 2 people that I interacted with Georgia Tech. Colin was on the search committee for the faculty. He had just joined the faculty the year before, so he was a first-year faculty member participating on a hiring committee. He called me up to invite me to come interview at Georgia Tech. And I knew about Colin's work in software engineering, and he was a big luminary in my mind, and he was the most gracious, still is today, the nicest individual. Kishore Ramachandran was the chair of the hiring committee, and he was in charge of coordinating with me the entire time that I was interviewing and preparing for all that, and then afterwards. 2 of the nicest people that, even if I had not gone to Georgia Tech, I came away with a very strong, positive impression of the place because of the impression these people gave me. So you are always making an impression on people. But in addition to that, there were a number of relatively young faculty that became my friends. I didn't even collaborate with many of these folks, particularly Jessica Hodgins, but Jessica and Chris were a couple. They were very close friends with me and Megan. Mark Guzdahl, who many know in the HCI community doing educational technology. John Stasko, very well known for his work in visualization. Ellen Zagura is a networking faculty and now works at NSF. Chris and Jessica, about 4 or 5 years after I joined Georgia Tech, moved to Carnegie Mellon. So let me tell you a little bit about what I decided to do once I got to Georgia Tech. I had a kind of silly picture I was going to show here, but I will spare you that. I really love mathematics. I love abstractions. I could have been a natural programmer because programming in my mind is all about picking the right representations and abstractions. But math was really fun to me, but I didn't see it really impacting the world that much. You can't pull someone over for the most part and give them some kind of mathematical representation and they will say, oh my gosh, you have so inspired me. That happens rarely, at least in my life, it happens very rarely. But there are people that I read about when I was a PhD student, wasting time, that were individuals who had either ideas or systems that made us think differently about the computational world around us. Vannevar Bush, who wrote the As We May Think article and proposed the mythical MEMX device. Ivan Sutherland, who as a master's and PhD student, essentially invented the world of computer graphics and virtual reality. Ted Nelson, who now you may not know so well, but this guy, when he was a master's student at Brown, coined the term hypertext in the 60s and led a kind of subculture of hackers that were working on systems that would bring information together. In 1986, when I was a first-year student at Oxford, hypertext came back into popularity. And Ted Nelson was a very popular speaker. And I had him come to Oxford to give a talk. And I thought, oh, my supervisor is going to be so impressed by this. I got the Ted Nelson to come speak. Well, he didn't know who Ted Nelson was. And Ted Nelson stood up in front of this room of distinguished computer scientists and said, I have discovered a suboptimal sorting algorithm. However, I am not going to share it with you. He also set up a video recorder in the back of the room and said, I record everything I say because I never know when I'm going to say something truly insightful. Those are not the kind of things you say to ingratiate an audience, to at least a computer science audience to you. I found him inspirational in writing, less inspirational in person. Doug Engelbart, who did the mother of all demos in the 60s, showing remote collaboration, showing a variety of different input devices on technologies. I had the fortune in the late 90s and early 2000s to visit Doug a couple of times in California, and he was a very gracious individual, extremely influential. And I just said to him, I want to be like you someday. Alan Kay, who is attributed with the phrase, the best way to predict the future is to invent it. Plenty of other people have said it, but he also said it, and did a lot of this work at Park that led to the personal computing revolution. The last individual here, Mark Weiser, I knew nothing about until I got to Georgia Tech. He wrote a very influential essay in September 1991 in Scientific American called The Computer of the 21st Century. I read that within the first few months of joining the faculty at Georgia Tech, and I said, wow, I could really get into this idea of computers of all different shapes and sizes that are essentially embedded throughout our everyday activity, and how would that influence our world? And I said, but that's really different from formal methods of software engineering. But I noticed that Georgia Tech was full of a lot of particularly undergrads who just were not afraid of any new technology, and like to build things and like to hack. And I said, okay, I can work with these individuals, and they can help me try to invent some kind of future. So together with Chris Atkinson, we created this group called the Future Computing Environments Group. And I'll read to you a little bit about what we were trying to do. Interested in developing a culture and infrastructure on campus for the investigation, prototyping, and construction of computing environments now that we believe will be commonplace in 10 to 15 years. So, predicting the future by inventing it. And this was in the mid to late 90s. And there were a couple of early successes that really were the key to this effort taking hold. First was the first example of an indoor location-aware touring system. And this was called CyberGuide. And the reason I think this really worked well was because it was used for a very specific purpose at Georgia Tech. Jim Foley, once a month, would have people come and set up all their demos in a number of different large labs that were there. And he would invite visitors from campus and from industry folks and other universities to come and see the work that we were doing. And they would get a map of our various labs and a thick booklet that would describe all the potential projects that they could see. And then they would have to essentially coordinate which project on that map they would want to see. We said, okay, this was right when handheld computers were having a little bit of a commercial success, and we got a bunch of Apple Newtons. We rigged an indoor positioning system that was ludicrously simple. We went to Radio Shack and bought 20 remote controls. We popped open the remote controls and soldered down one button, a different button on each of the remote controls, strung them to a power supply along the ceiling of the big lab so that they were always pressing a particular different number, which would be a different IR signal. Chris was a roboticist. He said, oh, we got these sensors that will essentially read the IR code and give you, spit out a number. So we attached that to the Newton, and Dietmar Aust and myself, over the course of about 3-4 days, hacked together an example of a map that would be show you where you are based on the IR code that they were under. And so we created an interaction that would show the map of the laboratory with stars showing where various demos are, and the one that you were closest to would be revealed, would be highlighted. And then you could keep track of the places you've been, and you could click on a bunch of these. And every month we iterated on this design based on feedback from people, so that over a year we had a robust enough system. And we wrote a paper, and Jason Hong, who's a full professor at Carnegie Mellon, was he was a sophomore undergrad at Georgia Tech at the time. He worked on the project. And this was our first kind of practical and intellectual success. And it happened within about 9 to 10 months after we started Future Computing Environments. That got us thinking a little more boldly. And I said, well, how can we do more of these examples of exploring the cutting edge technologies of the late 90s in everyday settings that would get used all the time? Well, as a professor, the obvious everyday setting for me was the classroom. And at the time, we were empowering instructors with more and more technologies like these projectors, the World Wide Web, so they could open up a bigger fire hose of information and shoot it straight at the students who would be sitting there, literally trying to write down everything that was happening. And though there is value to encoding your own thoughts as you're listening to something, there's not that much value when all you're really doing is acting like a stenographer and you're writing down everything. So I said, how could we reverse this a little bit and create an environment that would help record what happens in the live lecture setting so that students might pay a little more attention and then add additional annotations to it. That all evolved from a very simple example that I did in Visual Basic and then handed over to Nitin Sawhney, who was a master's student, who turned it into the first example of something I could use in an actual lecture. And then a PhD student, the former Jason Brotherton, took that and created this massive infrastructure that we could essentially put in place in a variety of lecture halls at Georgia Tech and a number of universities around Georgia and around the country. And this was my second big success and led to the first milestone in my career. And one of the things that I am most proud of, and I say this with my tongue firmly planted in my cheek, was a video that Jason wrote about the value of this project, Classroom 2000. So people my age and maybe 10 or 15 years younger than me, so, you know, down to 15, no, I'm almost 60. They might get this because this is a play on a series of commercials that was very popular in the 90s. The younger people here, trust me.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.
This is just music, so it's not so important you can hear it.
My gal rides in a limousine, but I buy the gasoline. Oh boy, that's where my money goes. Here's my gal, eats banana splits, but I eat cold bread and grits. Oh boy, that's where my money goes. Oh boy, that's where my money goes.
So for those of you that don't understand the tenure process, the dean is probably the last significant step on your way to getting approved for tenure. I was watching that last night and I looked and I said, you know, I had no idea that that was being filmed while I was lecturing to show you how focused I am on my audience. He was not my audience. Now, one thing I want to show you, that last picture, where are they now? So right at the on the bottom here, that's the former Jason Brotherton. They go by a different name. Now, he was the video mastermind. He was the brilliance behind Classroom 2000. This was his thesis research. Right at the top there, that's Aninde, who now doesn't have hair and is the dean at the University of Washington iSchool. Jen Mankoff is now his wife. She was also in our lab. She's an endowed chaired professor at the University of Washington in computer science. Kai Trong is a full professor at the University of Toronto. He took Jason's work and turned it into tools for tablets for students to take notes while the lecturer was presenting. David Nguyen was a PhD student and a master's student at Georgia Tech, but then he left and he went to MIT, then he left MIT and then he went to UC Irvine and he ended up being the PhD student of one of my former PhD students. He's now at University of Minnesota as an entrepreneurial advisor. Kent Lyons actually works in wearable computing, was one of Thad Starner's first PhD students, works at Toyota Research Institute. And Rob Orr was not at all associated with Classroom 2000, but he did work and he didn't finish a PhD with me, but he's become a very successful software entrepreneur. Okay, so this idea of taking new technologies and putting in place for people to use in their everyday activities, we refer to as living laboratories. A lot of people use this particular expression. And I said, Classroom 2000 to me, pre-tenure, was the shining example of living laboratories research. And I said, even before I got tenure, I said, okay, so what's next? So what was next was an effort to try to do things in a home or domestic, non-office, non-university space. In the late 90s, 1998, that's when broadband technology was starting to go out of the workplace and into the domestic space. And we said, well, what would it mean if we could create a home-like environment where people had very good connectivity within and outside the particular home? And it was initially called the Broadband Institute Residential Laboratory, which does not roll off the tongue, nor is it inspiring. And my colleague Irfan Issa, who was one of the faculty involved there, coined the term aware home, with the idea being what kind of services could a home environment provide to you if it was made more aware of the things you were doing inside that environment. This was a wonderful recruiting tool for faculty. So Irfan and Chris and I were faculty there. With this new laboratory that opened up in 2000, we were able to recruit people like Aaron Bobick, Thad Starner, Beth Minot. Wendy Rogers was already in psychology at Georgia Tech. I have to credit Beth Minot and Wendy with essentially taking the very tech-minded idea of Aware Home and providing the first really compelling use case, which we refer to as aging in place. You hear that phrase very commonly right now. An example of when you're too far ahead of the curve, you don't benefit commercially from your things, but you can stand back 30 years later and said, yes, we thought of all that before. And Beth and Wendy had this idea of aging in place and bringing us all together in terms of using these technologies to support an aging population in being able to maintain independence in their own home. Corey Kidd and Thomas O'Connell were examples of undergrads who worked and master's students that worked in the Aware Home. Corey was the first live-in manager for the building, and Thomas took over when Corey went to MIT to study robotics. There was one other one that missed. There was but we'll go on. Now, that era, the early 2000s, there were a lot of people that did a lot of really interesting things. These are a number of my PhD students at the time. You can see that all have moved on to very impressive careers. I don't have the time to tell you too much in detail what they did. I will point to the top person there, Shwetik Patel. He is the husband of Julie Keynes, who gave the very stirring introduction that people in the room here didn't hear. But I also had other colleagues. Matt Reynolds was a postdoc who then went to be a faculty at Duke and then went to the University of Washington. Master's students. This is Siddhant Gupta, who was very high up in Microsoft research and then started his own startup, CloudWorks. Mayan Goel is now an assistant/associate professor at Carnegie Mellon. This is the one I was talking about. Scott Saponis. I had lots of examples of this in my life. Scott showed up in my office the very first day of his first year as an undergraduate at Georgia Tech and said, I want to do something fun. So I took him in my car with another friend. We rode off. I told him about the Aware Home. We rode off to a Radio Shack. I said, buy whatever you want. We took it back to the Aware Home. I said, here is your sandbox. Play with it. He worked on various projects for 4 years, went to University of Washington to get his PhD, and now works in Microsoft research. But I had lots of examples of very young, early undergraduates who came in and stuck with it and did wonderful things. It was a really fun time. I remember Boston, Chi 2009, there was a caricature art that did this of myself, Shwetik, and Julie. We had fun. We celebrated when I became a full professor by putting up a bouncy castle, which was mainly for my son Blaze. Others could use it, but it was really for Blaze. And a number of people at this time even came from out of town to come celebrate. Julie mentioned this in passing, but this is what they did to my office when I was promoted to full professor. Literally every surface except the screen of my desktop display was covered in aluminum foil. Pencils, sheets of paper, ceiling tiles, and it was Shwetik found a way to buy the door of a porta potty, and they put that to replace my particular door. This to me, I would tolerate these things, but this to me is the greatest expression of love that a community can have for you, that they would go to this amount of effort to really interrupt your life. So now I want to transition to some of the things we did as the Aware Home started to mature. And there's a very interesting story that goes from doing playful, fun things to things that are much more serious. So Molly Stevens was a master's student in our HCI program, the one at Georgia Tech, and she was very interested in how you make it easy for people to collect memories throughout their lives. And so she was a design student, so she built a number of prototypes and video prototypes of what this experience would be like of this device she called the Living Memory Box. I had 2 master's students from Germany visit me one summer, and my father had died in 1998, and he left behind an archive of our family movies, an 8mm archive, probably about 35 hours worth of content. But they were on reels, and so you could only ever watch like a year at a time, 1964, for example. So I digitized all of this, and we created an environment in the Java Media Studio that would allow me to go through all of these videos highlight scenes, demarcate scenes, and add metadata to these scenes. This was in 2001, yes, prior to YouTube. And the thing that we did was we used some primitive machine learning of the time to do predictions on where scene boundaries might be. Take annotations from past scenes and use them to predict what future scene annotations might be, all to accelerate my ability to do this rich annotation. All these projects I could give an hour's talk on. The thing that was important about this is that, by the way, this is me right here. For those in internet land, the cutest person in the picture is me. And if you can't figure that out, it's the one on the right, even though most people think the little twerp in the middle is the cute guy. I started to digitize my own family videos because at that time I had two small boys, Aiden and Blaze. And the evening I was doing this conversion from the format on my camcorder to the format I needed for this particular tool, I noticed something very peculiar about my older son, Aiden, who already at that time had been diagnosed as with autism. He's a 27-year-old non-speaking individual with autism. And I saw in separate clips that were about 8 months separated, a change in his behavior. At 18 months, he looked, to my eyes, like a very typical 18-month-old in the way he would interact with mom and dad, respond to questions, point to parts of his body. And then 8 months later was an individual who did lots of verbal stimming and stimming with his hand and didn't particularly like to be near other people and wouldn't make eye contact. And I said, this transformation happened, in front of my wife and I, and we didn't notice it. It wasn't until we took him to get a test because we thought he needed to get tubes in his ears that the audiologist said, if he gets these tubes and he doesn't immediately change overnight, you should get him checked. And this was a little bit before he turned 2 years old. And it struck me years later when I looked at this video, I said, well, maybe there's something less whimsical that we can do with these capture technologies that could be helpful to track developmental progress. So around that time, Rosa Arriaga joined the faculty in the School of Interactive Computing at Georgia Tech. She's a developmental psychologist, and she didn't have anyone to work with. And I said, Rosa, I'll work with you. She took the office next to me, and we advised a large number of students who worked in the area of technology and autism. And I want to ask the audience here very quickly, what do you notice when you look at that set of pictures of individuals? Is there anything common about all of them but one? The gender. I do have on the next slide some other people, and there is one other male who worked on this idea of information technologies and autism. But this is an example, and it wasn't that I wasn't recruiting particular people. People knew what I was doing, but I think when you different demographics of individuals are attracted to different uses of technology. And if you have a broad portfolio of projects that you work on, you will, I believe, necessarily get a broader set of participation of individuals. And this was a clear example of these health-related technologies was attracting very good computer scientists, and they were all women. Julie was one that gave the intro. She and Jillian Hayes were the first students that took the leap, and this really was a leap as a computer science student to say you were going to work in the space of technology for autism, because they said, well, where's the computer science there? And I was really concerned about that as well. I had tenure, so my job wasn't at risk, but even when you have tenure, you're working with students who have a career they have to address as well. 25, 30 years later, I say, it's okay to be very application driven, because when you come at it with the lens of your disciplinary training, you often find the challenges there, and you have the passion for the problem that you're working on. I also wanted to work on taking the research more into practice to affect the clinical collaborators we had, the educators, and the families. So I worked with a number of other people. Jim Ray and I got a large funded expeditions project under the theme of behavioral imaging. Agatha Rosga joined as a research scientist. Audrey Sutherland was one of her first hires, and they helped us collect a large multimedia database of technology. Ihan worked with the Center for Discovery in upstate New York, trying to figure out ways to visualize all the collected data they were getting to inform their decisions. I met this man, Rob Oberleitner, on the left, who was also a graduate of the University of Notre Dame, who had a company that was trying to provide technologies for the population addressing autism. And two of the research, the PhD projects, Jillian Hayes' work on capturing after the fact critical incidents in a school setting, and Nazneen's work in trying to help remote diagnosis of autism by allowing families to take video snippets in natural settings and then share them for professionals to be able to annotate. And Ron helped to bring those to a commercial realization. I also then decided, because I had worked with so many different people in the autism space in Atlanta, a very rich environment for people working in genetics, in clinical support, teachers, other kinds of researchers. The CDC was there that was doing all the prevalence studies of autism, but these communities never talked to each other. And it was worse than that. They didn't like each other. So I said, that's got to stop. So we gathered together, went around to each other's labs for, every month for the first year, helped Children's Health Care of Atlanta establish the Marcus Autism Center and recruit Ami Klin from the Yale Child Study to come and be the leader. And now the Atlanta area is one of the leading places in autism research. And I think it's a lot because we were able to bring a community of people together to go after a larger goal. Over the years, it became less relevant to the researchers, this nonprofit that I started, and much more important to the community of practitioners and families and young adults. I'll come back to that. But this is, I'm probably mid-40s around this time. And of course, I needed to have a midlife crisis because that's what you do when you're mid-40s. And I had an intellectual midlife crisis, and I made the mistake of writing a paper about it. That was, I tried to put, evocative phrases in there like, UbiComp is dead. That's all people remember. Ewoud is trying to kill the community that he started. They didn't read the rest of long live ubiquitous computing. The argument being that everyone was working on what we called ubiquitous computing. So there was no need to have a niche conference. And I used Weiser's own words against us and said the most profound technologies is what he said. I said the most profound research topics are those that disappear. He meant disappear metaphorically. I kind of was suggesting literally that the UbiComp conference and community didn't need to exist anymore because everyone was doing UbiComp. Of course, you can never tell a group of people that like to get together once a year that they should stop doing it. So what was I thinking? I then thought, well, the thing to do is say, what could we be doing next? And if you look at the progression of technology over time, there's every 20 or 30 years, there's a new kind of paradigm of computing that's presented. And by by 2010, we had been well past the 1988 beginning of the UbiComp work at Xerox PARC. And so I wrote an article about, well, what were the technologies that Weiser didn't predict that became very entrenched in our everyday lives? And I phrase them as cloud technologies, distributed storage and computation, crowd technologies, bringing humans back into the computational loop. And what I referred to as shroud, because of course it needed to rhyme, so it would be memorable. But the shroud was essentially putting technologies on the surface of the living world, people and the physical world, to tighten the connection between the digital and the physical. That didn't take off. I also then said, well, I have a colleague, Thad Starner, who was one of the visionaries in wearable computing. And I said, well, what can I do to be more like Thad? Those at Georgia Tech know that Thad and I had a very friendly rivalry. He was always the kind of scatterbrained genius that would spend no time preparing for something and then come in and deliver a brilliant lecture. I would spend hours preparing something and give a slightly less than brilliant lecture. So I was always very jealous of that. So I started to have a lot of my students do things in wearable technologies, mostly wrist-mounted and smartphone-mounted technologies that do a variety of things of extending the interaction surface on these devices, being able to infer more information. Edison Tomaz now at UT Austin did the first work of kind of real-time eating detection using wrist-mounted technology. So a lot of these things that really by themselves, I'm doing a disservice to all these individuals by saying all I was trying to do was beat Thad Starner to the punch, which I never did. Then at this time, people, because consumer technologies were becoming more affordable and more widespread, you could start to do these kinds of studies at larger scale. And there was a very famous a project done at Dartmouth called Student Life that studied a cohort of 50 undergraduate and graduate students, and they had given them a smartphone. And they kept a lot of data, and they used that information to do very interesting things like infer what the grade point average of a student was based on 2 weeks of data early in the semester. Very interesting, kind of creepy, but very interesting kinds of things. And I said, well, now we can start to do these larger scale studies. So with two colleagues, Thomas Plutz and Munmunda Chowdhury, we started to look at how you might do these kinds of large scale population studies. And we focused mainly initially on a university population of individuals, and a lot of extremely interesting innovations in applied machine learning and the use of social media technology. Vedant is one of the star students in that, who's now a postdoc here at Northeastern and was co-advised by Moon and myself. So we get to around 2015, and I'm unsuccessful at chasing Thad Starner as being a visionary. I was inspired by a lot of visionaries, including Mark Weiser, and I said, well, let's see if I could take one more crack at being a visionary. So I pondered this phrase from Mark Weiser that most everyone knows, and I looked at that last sentence, that second sentence. They weave themselves into the fabric of everyday life until they're indistinguishable from it. And I was approached by a material scientist and chemical engineer at Georgia Tech. They said, Gregory, we don't know you at all, but someone said we should come talk to you. And they talked to me about some work they were doing in chemical engineering to fabricate high performance transistors in a way unlike any way that those computing technologies were fabricated. And I said they could produce billions of them as in a kind of chemical process. And I said, have you ever heard of Mark Weiser? And of course they hadn't. So I said, here's the paper, just read the first paragraph and then come back and talk. And that launched a series of activities with myself, Eric Vogel, and Mike Filler that convinced me that we could think of a very different way of producing computational materials that were literally woven into the fabric of everyday life. Long story there about things that we might do. This looks a little out of order. Yes, it is. So I'll do this first. This is some of the success over about 5 or 6 year period. Nivedita Arora, who's at Northwestern now, took a technique called triboelectric nanogeneration and turned it into a thin multilayer material that could automatically sense vibrations without need for any battery, and could use backscatter techniques to communicate it off the material. She did a bunch of other things as well. Dingten Zhang worked with me and Kenneth Fuentes, who's now here at faculty at Northeastern, in how you might use photodetectors to cheaply and with very little power requirements track human activity. Jungwook Park with Rosa Arriaga and I developed ways to be able to allow people to invent technologies on mobile environments that could harvest energy based on the specific environment. So the heat or the vibration or the wind that's around a car, and design a harvesting technology that would then support some sensing and computing capability at that point on the mobile environment or the automobile. Youngwook Do worked with myself and Shavik Das, who's now at Carnegie Mellon, in saying, how can you take computational materials and apply them to challenges relating to usable security and privacy? So it looked really good. A great trajectory for this computational materials work, and a lot of people around our community were starting to pick this up. But I realized just a couple of years ago that I had the wrong motivation for why to do this work in computational materials, because I realized that the world has an insatiable appetite for computation, data, storage, and inference on that data. Insatiable. Right? And I didn't think I was in a position to stop this, and I don't think many of us are in a position to stop that appetite. However, if you look at how we manufacture and operate computing objects, it's not sustainable, and it's a threat to our planet. We have to stop that. So to do that, if you believe those first two statements, we got to think very differently about how we make things that compute. I was thinking differently about how to make things that compute, but not for the right reasons, I feel now in retrospect. We have to challenge how things are powered, what materials we are using to make things that are computational, the processes we are using for manufacturing, and we have to think about the entire life cycle from cradle to grave, as they say. This is a much better motivation for working on computational materials, or what I call the Internet of Materials. And I fortunately have a growing set of collaborators here at Northeastern to pursue that particular area. I showed that one. So now the last stage of my life. I came to Northeastern as someone in a college of computer science to become the dean of a college of engineering with very little administrative experience, never had been a chair, never wanted to be a chair. Don't tell my chairs. I understand why I never wanted to be a chair, even more now that I'm a dean. But what really intrigued me about Northeastern was what it was like, what I was learning of Northeastern in 2020 and 2021 very much reminded me of what Georgia Tech's College of Computing was like when I joined there in 1994, by which I meant that they were on the rise and were willing to do lots of crazy, innovative things to continue rising. Northeastern was doing this as a whole. Georgia Tech was doing this in computing. And I learned in my time at Georgia Tech that leadership really matters to create a culture of continually pursuing excellence, never being satisfied, trying to empower people to be good. And I said, I want to take a stab at that. So I came to Northeastern, and I have a new family, an even larger family of 10,000 plus students in the College of Engineering, 300 plus faculty, many of whom I would like to be able to mentor their students. And so that's why I took this jump to come here. And there's a fantastic leadership team that's made it very easy to do things. The other interesting thing about Northeastern is that it's not containing itself to just Boston, right? There are 13 campuses. Come back this time next year, there will be 14 campuses that Northeastern has. And the College of Engineering participates in activities in all but one of these. So it's a wonderful opportunity. And I will go on to the next. So I'm just going to conclude here with a few thoughts. I had said these things: when you're surrounded by excellent colleagues, friends, and family, there's no need to be afraid of jumping into the unknown. And I've done that a number of times in my career. The people around you matter much more than I don't know something before I jump into it. And you can learn as much from negative examples of people. My supervisor as a PhD student was not the most nurturing, mentoring individual. He was a fantastic writer. And so I learned, I focused on that and not on how to his mentoring skills. And I had postdoc advisors that also had mentoring skills that I thought were lacking, and that helped me learn from the negative, as well as tremendous examples of friends and colleagues, brilliant students I worked with, and leaders. And I'll just remind you of these lifelong lessons that I talked about. We can come back to these if you want, but I just want to, and Julie said in the intro that you in the room didn't say, but for Gregory, it's all about family, and that is so true. So I just want to tell you a little bit about my family. So this picture here, a small picture, is my mother and father. This was on the day of their wedding. No, this was a Halloween where they're dressed up in a nice clown outfit. So from the two of them, came a family of 14, 12 brothers and sisters and my mom and dad. And then this is a family wedding. I think this was in around 2010. You count spouses and grandchildren. At that time, my blood family was about 58. Now it's probably about 15 to 20 larger because there are grandchildren. There are more weddings. I'm going to a wedding tomorrow. So it's grown. Over 60 years, went from 2 to 58. Okay, mom and dad, not bad. However, I got my PhD in 1991, just one person. When I turned 50 in Seattle, my students gave me this nice image of my academic family tree, which numbered, I think it was almost exactly 50 students. So in 20 years, it went from 1 to 50. As of last night, there are 198 PhD students and graduated, and 171 are pending. So this just tells you that the most important factor in the growth of a family is the gestation period, right? So little kids have to grow to, 15, 16-year-olds. In my family, it's usually 25 to 30 years old before you start to reproduce. In academia, I mean, some of my students take forever to get a PhD, but others take 4 or 5 years. So you can really start to multiply over that amount of time. But it's not just about quantity. So do you know what these 3 people have in common? They were all the Sig Chi doctoral dissertation awardees last year. You know what else they have in common? I'm very proud of that. No, I'm talking about the animation. So this is fantastic. None of my PhD students ever got a Chi dissertation awardees, but my students and their students got these awards. Now, I gave that talk last year. This year, we have another doctoral dissertation awardee. But also, as Julie mentioned, 3 of my students were inducted into the Chi Academy, making the total in our family 6, if you count me. I'm extremely proud of that. But here's the thing that blows my mind. A couple weeks ago, I went to the ACM Awards ceremony, and my own student, Evedito Aurora, first Georgia Tech PhD student ever to win the ACM Best Dissertation Award. At that same ceremony, Dr. John Abowd, my oldest brother, also got an award. And I was there to see it. So it was the beautiful combination of blood and academic family. And that just, for me, just topped it all. So with that, I'm going to say thank you and just point out that I've received so much more in my life than I have ever given. And I think if you take to bear some of the principles I talk about the importance of people, then I think you may find, I would hope you find the same thing in your lives as well. So with that, I will stop. And if there's any time for questions, I think this is scheduled to go to 1:30. But that's all I have to say. And I'll hand it back to you, Neha or Julie.
So I just want to invite questions from either the audience, and I'll let you manage the room questions, Gregory, since
Okay,
you
so if
can
there are
see
any
them
questions
there.
here, you can raise your hand. If there are
And
any
then if-
questions
yeah.
online, you can raise your hand.
Yeah, exactly.
You can put into the chat, and I promise my answers won't be as long as my talk.
Yeah, you did great.
I'm just looking at the, oh, sorry. We have 2 questions in here, okay?
Perfect, great.
So Saif will start, and I'll repeat the question and answer, and then we'll go to Christy.
Thank you, fantastic talk. So, for example, for the students who will be doing their PhD, what advice would you give them for managing when they're working with people who don't believe in them? For example, what strategies did you adopt when you encountered people who didn't believe in you and continued?
So the question here is to PhD students: if you find yourself in the position where you feel you are working with someone who doesn't believe in you, what do you do? And it's not an easy thing to say is leave that relationship, but that's not always something you can do. And it may also not be what you want to do, because there may be other reasons why you want to work with a particular individual. It's always important to realize as a PhD student that your advisor or 2 advisors, those are only 1 or 2 people in your academic life, right? And you will never be as successful as you can be if you only rely on those people. So very early on in your career, you need to seek other kinds of mentorship, collaboration, friendship. So you can seek that from your student peer colleagues who may be experiencing some of the same things that you're going through, may also be able to kind of level you out in terms of your overly negative interpretations of what your advisor may have said. So that's a good kind of influence. Seek other kinds of colleagues. I know for some this is challenging because there are, unfortunately, advisors in this world who do not make it easy for you to collaborate with other people, right? That is a very poor mentoring philosophy. You should always have the best interests of the people you are mentoring, not your selfish interests in mind. You will get things out of this, but you need to think about serving those others. So seek those who will support you, not people that will be sycophants and will just say, you're right, they're wrong. No, people that will be constructive with you, but will help to nurture that experience. I basically did my PhD without really ever interacting with my advisor. I had a meeting with him the month before I turned in my thesis, where he basically compared my thesis to a toilet. That's why a toilet is something that's common in my life. That's a nice little story. But I didn't need at Oxford. You're not examined by your advisor. You're examined by one internal faculty member and one external faculty member. So in the end, it really didn't matter. All that mattered was that external person. And fortunately, my advisor allowed me to have some input in who that external person would be. So I hope that helped. Christy.
Yeah, so you shared a lot of excellent examples of supplies. Good overview and highlight. Can you share some examples of some of the lows and maybe how you overcame them?
Well, I'm a pretty glass half full kind of guy. It was not fun when I was a PhD student struggling and having an advisor who really didn't care. At that time, I had my girlfriend, my fiance, and I had lots of friends to help me. And I had a career of a lot of academic success. So I knew that I had something. And I found people to pull me out of that. I had a very traumatic breakup with someone who I had gone out with my entire undergraduate career, who had moved to England with me, and then within 6 months, that was but I had friends, new friends, that helped me overcome that. I wouldn't say it was traumatic when my oldest son was diagnosed with autism, because I didn't really know what it was. I didn't know what would transpire for him. I knew that we needed to do something. It was more debilitating when the second son was diagnosed with autism, because he could talk. And we said, wait a second, he can talk. But then we realized that the way he spoke was different, and how things he perseverated on was different. And the fact that people who suspected that he had delay purposely hid that from my wife and I, and we became pregnant with a third child, knowing that the chances of multiple individuals having developmental disabilities goes up as you have multiple children. And so the look on my wife's face when we had the ultrasound and learned that our third child was a girl was a tremendous look of relief. And they said, oh, but there's a problem with this, the way her kidneys are and the connection to the kidneys. There's a long term that my daughter and my wife know that I always get wrong. They said, so we're really sorry, we're gonna have to monitor her, and she's probably gonna have to have a major operation by the time she's 2. And we looked at him and said, oh, you can fix that? No problem. I think, my wife and I struggled a little bit with that, but I have many years to reflect on this. I am the person I am because of those kinds of experiences. I had a horrible experience in high school. I was a very good basketball player, but I was prevented from playing because there were parents who were much more powerful than my parents. And I remember the coach pulling me over and said, Gregory, you did great in the Catholic League Championship, but I'm gonna have to sit you for the rest of the year. Those kind of things you have. And I said, okay, well, don't worry about things in life that you cannot control. So we all have these kinds of things. And I never was properly trained as a computer scientist. So yeah, I had imposter syndrome. I was a very good mathematician. When I coded, I wrote beautiful code, but it was never fast, and it wasn't particularly fun. But I knew lots of people were really good at it, and they really jazzed me up when they would be building things, and I have high-level design ideas that they could manifest. So, you do what you can.
Gregory, there's
Did I
a question
sufficiently bore the
online.
audience?
No, there's a
There-
question online. Will Page asks, do you think the paradigm of UbiComp has been harmful to users in certain ways or primarily to the planet?
So this question is, do you think the paradigm of ubiquitous computing has been harmful to users, not just the planet? There are plenty of people preceding my understanding of sustainability as being a motivation for what I want to do in ubiquitous computing. Plenty of people that have mentioned how these visions of a disappearing or always available technologies are both harmful in the way it people thinking that technologies will always work perfectly, And if the technologies don't work perfectly, it's a problem of the individual, not a problem of the technology. These notions of what Genevieve Bell or Paul Dorsch write about this idyllic, you see lots of technological visions of the future paint everything as working all the time, when we know that nothing ever works perfectly, and we should be talking and thinking about those kinds. So there's definitely been lots of damage there. In this day and age, many people thinking about this notion of technology everywhere. When can I ever detach myself or control the sensing and recording of things about myself? And this balance between the good that you can have with a lot of information about your own activities and insights from that versus what happens when it gets in the hands of other people. And try as we might, there is no way we can prevent other people from getting these data and have some service given back to us. I learned that lesson very early on with location. People say, well, I don't want people to know where I am all the time. And people would say, well, if you compute location on a device, then you control it. I go, yes, but unless you give it up to someone else, you don't get any value add from that location. So you end up giving it to people and they do with it what we want. So I guess I didn't mention it explicitly, but absolutely, there's always been this concern about the effect of more and more computing on our human experience.
All right, we also have a second question from Ganesh Budkar, who actually asked the question I was going to ask you, which is, how do you
Okay.
manage the balance of added administrative responsibility, dean work, with HCI and other research work?
Okay, today is Friday. Friday is my research day. The evenings too. When I left Georgia Tech, I had 9 PhD students that I left behind at Georgia Tech, and I would try, and you can don't take my word for it, take the word from Vedant. I would try to meet with them still regularly with their co-advisor, usually in the late afternoon during the week or on Friday. And I meet with a number, Joy here, I meet with her every other Friday in my office. So Friday is my research day. I have been without really doing it intentionally, I've adjusted my meeting schedule this summer such that what used to be a lot of hour-long meetings with a bunch of people throughout the week is now compressed into a number of 30-minute reports on Thursdays. Ingzi here is aware of this. And about a month ago, I realized that, my gosh, in the middle of the day, I got so much more time and I'm reading things that I didn't do before. Why? Is it because the summer's lazy? No, it's because I adjusted meeting schedule. So I've learned to make meetings much more efficient. So, and you know, you do things that that matter to you. When I came to Northeastern, I made very clear to them there are 3 things that academics can do. They can do teaching, they can do research, and they can do administration at their university. I said I'll do 2 of those, right? I like teaching, I love talking to people, I like research even more. So, and I couldn't opt on the administrative piece.
Can I have a follow-up question on that, Gregory? So how do
Yes,
you,
Julian, I think I know where it's going.
Oh, maybe. I was gonna say, how do you integrate your leadership and your research at all, right? You kind of talk about having like a certain days, but is there a way you could, given that one of your top recommendations on leadership was how
Yes.
important that was, is there a way that you've integrated them too?
That's an even better question I thought you were going to ask, Julie. So she
Oh,
asked, how
okay.
do I integrate my leadership with research? So when I came to Northeastern, I thought it was important to look at strengths of an organization, and College of Engineering has a lot of strengths. But when you want to think about where should we be going, I'm the kind of person who's never complacent. You can always be doing better. You should always challenge yourself to do more. And the world isn't just about engineering. I said, how do we start to have conversations that build on our strengths and take us in different directions? And I posed one potential idea, which was my own research agenda. I said, let's see if there are people around College of Engineering and beyond that might be interested in this vision of Internet of Materials. And from that grew a team of individuals, but it was meant to show an example of how you, if you have people meet regularly over 2-3 months, then you can start to form a community and you can start to build ideas that they can work on. And this is something that the College of Engineering has continued to do, and particularly with this shift of motivation towards sustainability, that picks at even more people's interests as researchers. So we just yesterday had a series of lightning talks on people from across the university doing work in sustainability as it relates to electronics. So
Great, thank you.
research leadership is what you do
Mhm.
as a PhD mentor. So I tried to bring that part of my work in. The other thing I would say, well, this is not about research. So I have another leadership philosophy, but I won't bore you with that.
Great. Matthias asked two questions. He says he first met you at Heidelberg for the Gadget Show at UBComp and had a great experience there, but he had questions. Do you have any tricks when you feel lack of inspiration for your future research?
Okay, so I'll just read the question to the people here. So it was nice to hear behind the scenes of such a successful career. Two questions, if there's time. Do you have any tricks when you feel lack of inspiration for your future research? I'm not sure there's been a period where I felt there was no inspiration for things we're doing, but there was a period of time, and Julie was in the lab at that time, where I realized that I was working with about 10 different PhD students on 10 different PhD projects. And I felt that not only was I intellectually being spread too thinly, that I thought we were losing the value of people working together. And this was not an observation I made. This was an observation that Julie and her colleagues, Shwetik, Jillian, Giovanni, and others all said, why don't we do something together? So they pitched to me a project that they could do together. And it was amazing to see how there are different perspectives and different skill sets pulled together. And this was an example of Gregory Says You Could Never Do It. In a very short period of time, did an extremely insightful and I would argue influential type of study on an emerging technology. So I learned that in times of those kinds of crises, the people around you can often help provide inspiration. And it's not just your colleagues, other faculty members, it's often students that have this kind of inspiration. There was another one. And
Yeah,
what would
he
you
also
consider
asked, biggest failure.
my
yeah.
biggest failure? My biggest failure. Oh, I know, biggest failure. So when the Aware Home started, I was obsessed on this idea that if you have an aware environment, it can know where things are. And one of the problems we have, and at the time I thought, one of the problems that frail old people have is that they lose things. Actually, that's not true, because frail old people know that they lose things. As a result, they adjust what they do to prevent them from losing. It's these virile middle-aged individuals who think they can do everything, that have children, that are independent agents that can move things. We lose things all the time. And so I was convinced that technology could help you find lost objects. And that theme of find lost objects killed the PhD career of countless individuals. I still to this day believe that there is a human way to do finding lost objects, but that was probably one of my biggest failures. And I'm sure, Julie, you would completely agree with that statement.
Well, if you remember, I actually wrote a paper about finding lost objects for assets
You
one
did,
year, and I
you
might have
did,
been
you did, and you
your
were able
only
to, you survived
successful.
it. Yes, you
survived.
very
I broke the
quickly
curse.
pivoted. You very quickly pivoted to a different theme.
I broke the curse. Excellent. Naman has a question as well too. If it's easier for you to just read it, then that's great since I can't hear me anyways.
Let me see. This is too. How do you seek research collaborations and connections as an outsider in HCI? Outsiders may not have access, privilege, or exposure to HCI people who are well connected and resourced. Yes, Georgia Tech, Carnegie Mellon. So that's interesting, because what I was gonna say was you have a big advantage as an outsider. So Kai Trung gave me this little ornament that's in my office to this day that has an individual sitting on this little wire frame outside of a wire box. And he gave it to me for thinking outside the box. And for many years, I thought one of the reasons people think I'm an outside the box thinker is because in many situations, I was never in the box to begin with. So if you were not trained as a computer scientist, you don't have the biases of a computer scientist. If you were never a researcher in autism, you don't have the biases of a researcher in autism. If you're not an administrator in an engineering college, you don't have the biases of people in engineering. So your natural questions that come out of your ignorance to some people get interpreted as, oh, a fresh perspective. He's such an out of the box thinker. I go, great. I didn't know whether that was in the box or out of the box. So you have an advantage as an outsider. But I think, Naaman, your question is more about when you're not at a place that has a lot of, I would say, the human resources and the mindset about HCI, that is difficult for you to go down that particular path. That's exactly what I had at Oxford. There was no one at Oxford in the programming research group that cared a hoot about human computer interaction when I was a PhD student. So I found other people and found communities. Today, it's much, it's much more ubiquitous, HCI research. You had a different way of phrasing it, so I'm going to make sure I'm answering. The other way to put restricted in terms of the kind of HCI research that can be done. I would say the HCI is so broad. Yeah, a lot. Yes. Okay. My own personal feeling, and my apologies to Neha and all the other executives connected to the CHI conferences. I believe the CHI conference is an example of what's wrong with HCI, and that if you try to answer the question, what belongs at the CHI conference and what doesn't, you'd have a very hard time. Because as soon as you say, who would have said 20 years ago that feminism should be in CHI? Who would have said 20 years ago that autism research should be at CHI? But it's both a positive and a negative. On the positive side, it is a community that appreciates looking at a problem of the world and seeing how our tools and techniques can make a difference in that world. The downside of it is that we often do not have the ability to judge if we're making a difference in that other world. So we talk to ourselves, and I am the most to blame for it. My early research, and Julie was, I think there was a pity vote in favor of this work because, oh, it's so meaningful that they're helping the poor families and individuals with autism. Let's give the benefit of the doubt. And I think we see a lot of that in a community like CHI that is so accepting of a variety of different domains of discourse and not always very demanding intellectually of what the contributions are. But by and large, it's probably better that we have more people thinking about important problems of the world. And this is one of the messages I had in the UBComp is Dead paper, that we should take our results that we first seed in our own UBComp or CHI communities and then get it to the communities that can really judge. So I said we should document those successes of research. Autism research shouldn't really be in CHI. It should be in the places where that's done and judged in that. A community may have been birthed in that place, but they should graduate from there. We should celebrate the launching of that of those set of people and have them be successful in their own area. So sorry, I was both long and probably didn't answer your question. Do you want me to read this other one from Zhufu? How do you define
sure.
the future
Yeah, go for it.
promising directions of ubiquitous computing? Yeah, those are always hard. I would define them by never saying something will not happen. How's that for a start? Somebody is very interesting, but without device manufacturers' help, they can only stay in the. Yeah, this is very interesting. What I think is different in our world today. Alan Kay, who I had the privilege of meeting a couple of times, used to always say that you should build yourself an environment that would be commonplace 10 years from now. And I think over time, that's become increasingly difficult to do, right? It would have been hard. Thank you. It would have been hard for us to have created something as sleek and compact and functional as a smartphone on our own in probably 1992. But he was suggesting that's what we needed to do in order to be able to explore it. And I think that's harder and harder to do. A lot of researchers thought answer is HI task related, artificial AI, or health related UBComp research. Well, I mean, I'm surprised no one's asking me about generative AI, and I'm glad because that's an area I would never want to predict what's going to happen next. I'm listening to Ray Kurzweil's The Singularity is Nearer book. Very interesting predictions that are coming true even faster than he thought 20 years ago.
Well, Neha, I think we're almost at time, right? Or is this
Yeah, we have one question here. Yeah, we are at time.
Okay,
so
great. Yeah, go for it. Yeah, go for it.
What's your question, Vedant?
An involvement and influence on so many students. So your you're obviously spreading yourself thin. So how do you ensure that you don't get desensitized
Hmm.
while still protecting
Yeah.
things while they're going through their
Yeah, so the question Vedant was asking, who was one of my former PhD students, is as you have a larger and larger group, there's a couple things I was pulling out. How do you remain fresh to the experiences of a PhD student when you've already experienced that through other people 10, 20, 30 times before? Which is something I struggled with early in my career. And I realized that this is advice I have to faculty. Having a pipeline of students is very important because students are more in tune with what students are concerned with. So having student peer colleagues and ones that are a little more senior that have been down the road that you've been down. Vedant probably would heard, and Julie may have heard this. I would never spend much time on my own remembering all the rules and regulations for when a PhD student has to do certain milestones, because I don't really have much incentive to know that. The student has all the incentive. I am pretty good about saying, well, if I have to turn in this thesis by this date, what should I do to get there? I said, okay, I can have that conversation with you. But I've often had to remind myself that remember, these people don't have the experience that other PhD students have, and they're not just going to magically get it if you don't make it explicit. It's why I spent more time in my mid-career developing activities at Georgia Tech that were about training PhD students about the PhD life and trying to make explicit the things that often are implicit or even missing in the mentoring relationship between faculty and student. Okay, so that's it, Julie.
Yeah, with that, yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Neha and Sidkai, for giving us the opportunity to hear your talk again and record it for everyone out there. And sorry, the roommate didn't get to hear the introduction, but hopefully you'll be able to catch the recording. So thank you, Gregory. Much love to you.
Thank you,
and much love
Julie.
to everybody in the audience. Take care.